The horse stood alone under the pale wash of moonlight, ribs showing through its thin coat, eyes heavy with a sorrow that seemed too deep for any creature to bear. Its mane hung in tangled clumps, and every breath it took came out like a weary sigh against the silence of the plains. Then, out of nowhere, it let out a cry. Not the strong, defiant neigh of a stallion, but a broken, aching sound that drifted through the night air like a ghost. The kind of cry that carried loneliness, begging for someone, anyone, to listen. That sound reached the boy's ears. He sat up from the thin blanket he called a bed, heart thudding at the strange noise. He had heard coyotes howl, owls screech, even the distant crack of gunfire in the hills. But never a sound like this. It was almost human, almost pleading. The boy slipped outside, bare feet crunching against the cold dirt. The wind pushed through the grass in whispers, and the stars hung sharp and cold above him. There, in the distance, he saw it. The horse. Standing still, staring straight at him, as if it had been calling just for him. For a long moment, they only watched each other. Two creatures forgotten by the world, bound by a loneliness neither had chosen. Something inside the boy stirred. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. The horse's sadness was his own, and he couldn't turn away from it. As the night stretched on, that strange connection wrapped around him tighter. He didn't yet know why the horse had called, or what it wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. From that moment, his life would no longer be the same. By morning, the boy's eyes were heavy, but his heart carried the sound of that midnight cry. It wasn't just the horse's sorrow that had unsettled him. It was the way it mirrored his own. He was no stranger to loneliness. The town had watched him grow up with dirt on his face and hunger in his belly. His vehicle. Arthur had been buried on Boot Hill after a railroad accident, and his mother, worn down by sickness and sorrow, was gone not long after. Since then, he had belonged to no one. Folks pitied him from afar, but pity never filled a stomach. The boy survived on scraps and odd jobs, mending fences, running errands, sometimes sleeping in barns when the cold nights rolled in. He was tough in the way only orphans become, hardened by necessity, but not so hard that his heart had turned to stone. Somewhere beneath the grit and scars, kindness still lived. That's why he couldn't ignore the horse. He found it tied near a weathered post at the edge of town, bones jutting out under its skin. The creature looked half dead already, as though life itself had forgotten it. Its eyes weren't wild or mean, just hollow, like a soul that had been broken down piece by piece. The stable owner had written it off as worthless. "A bad horse," he said, waving a hand. "Can't be tamed. Ain't no use feeding what's already gone." But the boy didn't see a bad horse. He saw himself reflected in that gaze. Unwanted, cast aside, left to survive or wither. He stood there longer than he meant to, his empty pockets pressed flat against his thighs. He had nothing. No money for feed, no land for pasture, not even a bed to offer. But still, he reached out a hand. The horse flinched at first, then leaned forward, pressing its muzzle gently into the boy's palm. That was all it took. Without asking permission, without weighing the cost, the boy claimed him. He didn't care if others laughed, or if the animal ate the last of his hard-earned coins. This wasn't about practicality. It was about belonging. For the first time in his young life, the boy wasn't entirely alone. The saddest horse in town had chosen him, and he had chosen it right back. And somewhere deep inside, though neither of them could see it yet, a bond was about to pull them into a story far larger than either could imagine. It began with a restless stirring. The boy had tied the horse to a post near the barn, but sometime after midnight, he woke to the sound of hooves scraping against the dirt. The animal wasn't sleeping. It pulled at the rope, ears flicking back and forth, as though it had heard something only it could understand. The boy rose slowly, blinking against the silver wash of moonlight. "Easy now," he whispered. But the horse wasn't spooked. It was insistent. It tossed its head, nudging toward the tree line beyond the pasture. And then it did something the boy had never seen before. It looked back at him, not with fear, not with hunger, but with urgency. Against his better judgment, the boy untied the rope. The horse stepped forward, paused, then waited for him to follow. Step by step they crossed the open field together, the night pressing thick around them. Crickets sang low, the wind moved through the tall grass, and every so often the horse would stop and glance back, making sure he was still behind. The further they went, the more uneasy he felt. The trees swallowed the starlight, branches clawing overhead. The boy's boots crunched on fallen twigs, his breath coming faster now. Yet the horse kept leading him deeper, as though it knew exactly where to go. Then, through the darkness, he saw it. A shack, half hidden under the pines. Old wood, sagging roof, no lanterns lit. At first he thought it abandoned, but when the horse stopped short and snorted, the boy caught the faint glint of metal through the cracks in the wall. He crept closer, heart pounding. Inside, stacked against the far wall, were rifles. Dozens of them. Boxes of ammunition. And on a rough-hewn table lay maps marked with circles, ranches, railroads, even the town itself. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a shack. It was a hideout. The boy stepped back, every nerve on edge. He knew enough of the outlaw gangs that drifted through these parts, men who would burn fields, steal cattle, and leave nothing but ashes behind. And now he had stumbled on proof of their plans. The horse shifted nervously, pawing at the ground as if to say, "We shouldn't be here." But it had brought him for a reason. The boy's chest tightened. He was no lawman, no gunslinger, just a half-starved orphan with a broken horse. Yet as he stared at those rifles in the moonlight, he understood something. He wasn't meant to find this by accident. The horse had led him here, and from this night forward, his life was tied to a danger far bigger than himself. He gripped the reins, backing away into the shadows, mind racing. Somewhere in the stillness, a twig snapped. Not his. Someone else was near. He and the horse fled quietly through the trees, hearts pounding in rhythm. By the time they returned to the barn, dawn's first pale glow had touched the horizon. The boy sank down beside the horse, breathless, shaken, but certain of one thing. The saddest horse in town carried secrets in its heart, and those secrets had just dragged him into a war he wasn't ready to fight. The horse was uneasy for days after that night in the woods. Every time the wind carried a sound from the hills, its ears flicked back, nostrils flaring. It would stomp the dirt, restless, like it remembered something the boy could never see. That's when he began to piece it together. The shack wasn't just a place for weapons. It was a lair. Word had spread in whispers across the town about a gang that had been cutting its way through ranchland. Families run off, barns burned to cinders, and cattle stolen in the night. Some said they were ghosts of the frontier, but the boy knew better now. He had seen their marks scratched into the maps. And the horse had known exactly where to lead him. One evening, while brushing down its bad coat, he spotted an old brand seared into the animal's hide. Jagged, cruel, not like the marks the ranchers used. It was the gang's sign. His chest tightened. This poor creature hadn't just been abandoned. It had belonged to them once. Whatever horrors it had endured under their reigns explained the shadows in its eyes. The boy didn't sleep much after that. He kept watch, scanning the hills, knowing it was only a matter of time before those men returned. And when they did, he would have to be ready. It happened sooner than he expected. The night was still. The barn quiet, when the horse suddenly stiffened. Its head shot up, ears locked toward the tree line. The boy followed its gaze and saw the glow of lanterns weaving through the dark. Voices carried low, rough and mean. The outlaws had come back to their shack. His heart hammered. He ducked low, pulling the horse with him, guiding it behind the barn. The men passed close, their boots crunching gravel, laughter sharp as knives. Through the cracks of the boards he caught sight of them. 6, maybe 7. Dust-caked coats, pistols at their sides, and eyes that carried no mercy. The boy held his breath, praying they wouldn't see him. The horse stayed still beside him, every muscle taut, but silent, as if it too understood the danger. The men disappeared into the shack, their voices rising inside. The boy didn't wait to hear more. He slipped away, guiding the horse back toward the hills. By dawn he was far from the shack, but the danger hadn't passed. Days later, smoke rose on the horizon. The gang had struck again, torching a ranch just outside of town. He heard the cries of families who had lost everything, saw wagons rolling away loaded with what little survivors could carry. Fear settled over the land like a heavy blanket. Folks locked their doors, and no one dared ride out after dark. The boy felt the weight of a choice pressing down on him. He and the horse could disappear, hide in the hills, pretend none of this was their burden. But every time he looked into the Nimmel's haunted eyes, he knew it wasn't that simple. They had both suffered under the cruelty of men like this gang. To walk away now would mean letting the same cruelty spread unchecked. As the sun bled red over the plains one evening, the boy ran his hand along the horse's neck and whispered, "We can't stay hidden forever." The animal turned its head, watching him with a steady, knowing gaze. It was as if the saddest horse in town had been waiting for him to find his courage. Together, they stood in the shadow of the outlaws, and together they would decide whether to fight back. The horse sensed it before the boy did. Its ears shot forward, nostrils flaring as it pawed the ground, restless under the weight of the midnight air. Then came the distant glow, orange flames licking at the horizon. The outlaws had struck again, and this time they weren't just burning barns. They were tearing through a ranch with no mercy. The boy felt fear grip his chest, but the horse pressed against him, as if demanding he ride. There was no hesitation left. He swung into the saddle, clutching the reins tight, and together they thundered across the open field, the night wind stinging his face. The closer they came, the louder it grew. Gunshots cracked through the dark. Cows bawled in terror as fences collapsed under fire. The ranch house blazed, throwing sparks into the sky. Men on horseback shouted orders, their voices carrying the cruelty of wolves circling prey. The boy's pulse hammered in his ears. He wasn't trained, wasn't armed like them, but the horse darted left, then right, weaving through shadows with uncanny precision, almost as if it remembered their patterns, as if it had danced in this chaos before. They burst into the yard, just as one outlaw lit a torch and hurled it toward the haystacks. Without thinking, the boy kicked hard and the horse lunged. Its hooves struck the man square in the chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt, the torch rolling harmlessly aside. The boy didn't have time to celebrate. The crack of a rifle whistled past his head. "Ride!" he shouted. But the horse was already moving, twisting around burning fences, bullets splitting the night. Each shot missed by inches, each dodge so precise it felt more like instinct than chance. Together, they carved chaos into the chaos. But the gang leader was different. He stood tall in the saddle, scarred face lit by firelight, barking orders that drove his men like hounds. His eyes locked on the boy with a fury that froze the blood. Raising his pistol, he aimed steady and fired. The boy ducked, the shot grazing his shoulder, heat burning into his flesh. He cried out, but held on. The horse bolted toward the leader, fearless, like it had been waiting for this moment. The boy leaned low, clutching its mane as they charged. The outlaw tried to turn, but the horse slammed into his mount, sending both men crashing into the dirt. The boy hit the ground hard, the world spinning. He tasted blood, felt gravel tear into his palms. Through the blur, he saw the leader rise, pistol aimed right at him. But before the shot rang, the horse reared. Its front hooves came down with the force of thunder, knocking the gun from the outlaw's hand. The boy scrambled, snatched up the weapon, and in that instant the tables turned. The gang froze. Smoke, fire, the screams of cattle. It all went silent under the weight of what they saw. A ragged orphan boy, standing tall with the pistol of their leader in his grip. The saddest horse in the West towering behind him. He didn't need to pull the trigger. The truth was already written in their eyes. Their leader was beaten, their power broken by a boy they had never thought twice about. One by one, the outlaws dropped their weapons, slinking back into the night. The flames still roared, but the ranch had been saved. The boy stood trembling, shoulder bleeding, breath ragged, but alive. He turned to the horse, laying a hand again against its sweat-soaked neck. "We did it," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it had been courage or the horse's uncanny will that carried them through. Either way, under that burning sky, justice had come from the unlikeliest of riders. The morning after the fire smelled of smoke and ash, but also of something new. Relief. The outlaws who had once ruled the hills were gone, their weapons seized, their leader lying in chains. What had begun as a midnight cry from a forgotten horse had ended in justice that no sheriff had dared to deliver. The boy rode slowly back into town, his wounded shoulder bandaged, his clothes scorched by the night's battle. The streets, once cold to him, now filled with faces. Men tipped their hats, women nodded in quiet respect, and children stared with wide eyes, whispering that the orphan boy had done what no grown man had dared. But the boy didn't ride in like a hero. He sat tall, but his eyes stayed on the horse beneath him, the same broken creature that had once stood trembling in the moonlight. Now its head was high, its step steady. The sorrow in its eyes had lifted, replaced by a quiet strength. Together, they were no longer the outcasts the world had cast aside. At the livery, the townsfolk gathered, asking questions, offering food, even offering him a place to sleep. The boy who once had nothing now had more than he could take in. But he wasn't thinking about praise or reward. He thought about belonging. For the first time since he could remember, he felt like he wasn't walking this world alone. Days passed, and life on the frontier steadied. The ranch that had burned began to rebuild, neighbors lending hands and lumber. The boy worked beside them, no longer the hungry orphan on the edge of things, but a part of something greater. Each night he returned to the barn where the horse waited, and each morning the two walked out toggle, ether into the rising sun. One evening, as the light faded to gold, he brushed the horse's mane and whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" The animal flicked its ears, nuzzling his shoulder with a gentleness that said more than words ever could. It wasn't just survival they had found. It was redemption. The saddest horse was no longer broken, and the boy was no longer alone. Their scars had become proof of strength, their bond a promise that no darkness could take away. As the prairie wind swept across the fields, carrying with it the smell of new grass and the sound of hammers rebuilding, the boy understood. This was home, not a roof or a bed, but a place in the world, earned through fire and courage. And when dawn broke again, painting the land in light, horse and rider stood together at the edge of town. Two souls, once abandoned, now standing tall, ready for whatever the frontier would bring next. The horse stood at the edge of town as dawn broke, its mane glowing gold in the rising sun. Beside it, The boy rested a hand against its neck, no longer an orphan on the outside of life, but a rider who had earned his place through courage. It's a strange truth of the West. Sometimes the loneliest creatures, whether a half-starved boy or a broken horse, carry the strongest spirit. Out of sorrow, they find strength. Out of abandonment, they discover belonging. And together, they write stories no one ever forgets. As the prairie wind whispered across the land, the boy and the saddest horse, now whole again, stood like guardians of a new beginning. Their scars no longer defined them. Their bond did. And to you listening now, if this tale stirred something in your heart, there are more stories of courage, of loyalty, and of the wild waiting to be told. Ride on to the next one.